Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for your invitation. My apologies for not having attended the morning session. I had to lecture this morning, and this is a very busy period just before Easter at university, so it was difficult to reschedule. So I will also address the same topic as Eduardo mentioned in the introduction of e-commerce and the role of platforms. So the role of platforms in particular in B2C, so the sales made by consumers online. Now we know that the B2C sector initially, when we think back of the 90s with the first work of the OECD on e-commerce, really looked at B2C sector as marginal. All the focus was on B2B, but now we know that B2C is becoming really a booming sector. It's not yet reached saturation, so it will increase, it will still increase in the coming year. And the global trend as a consumer, when you buy online, is that you increasingly buy from sellers that are abroad, and that you increasingly, more specifically, that you increasingly buy goods that will be imported. And so this is a reality for European customers. This is also a reality in China and other Asian countries, in Australia and etc. So the UNCTAD made that very clear in their latest report on the digital economy. Now the development of this B2C, this cross-border B2C, is obviously due because of the development of platforms, of online intermediaries. You would be less likely probably to buy from a non-established suppliers if you did not have the medium of the platforms. So this may come as a surprise because of course the internet offered the possibility of a disintermediation, because in theory it offers you access to a global customer base, but in reality what actually happens is a strong re-intermediation process. We buy most of the time, in the majority of the time, according to some survey, notably, for example, International Post Corporation, telling us that 2 out of 3 e-commerce sales are actually made via a digital platform. Now, the success can be explained because of the role that these platforms are playing, not only bringing customer and supplier into contact, but also offering other services. And when I'm talking about a re-intermediation, I think we can also talk about a concentration process, in a sense that some platform, a handful of marketplaces, have actually captured most of the B2C e-commerce sector, and we can name maybe 5 platforms that everybody knows and everybody uses for most of their purchases. Now, what is the role of a platform? So they facilitate cross-border trade, and because of platform, if we look for the European perspective, we know that we routinely buy goods on the internet that actually come from China. Now, from a VAT perspective, of course, the person who is the supplier, the taxable person, well, that's the supplier, that's the underlying vendor. So normally, the platform, of course, would not have any VAT liability, except that because of the central role that they have, because of the fact that you only have a handful of them in the world, well, having most of the market, there is increasing interest on the side of states to actually use the platforms to ensure the collection of VAT, because, as mentioned in the previous speech, the real problem is enforcement. Yes, you are entitled to the VAT when one of your customers buys something online, but the problem is that your tax collector increasingly will be located abroad. So you need means to ensure that everybody collects the VAT they owe to you, and that is much more complicated when this is a Chinese business or a business located anywhere else in the world than within your jurisdiction. So at the OECD, at the level of the OECD, many countries are discussing, and so we have guidelines from the OECD mentioning that this would be an appropriate model to use these platforms to collect the VAT, to make sure that there would be a higher level of compliance. Now, if I look at the situation in the EU, there are 2 approaches actually currently. There is one approach that I will develop a bit, but that was already mentioned by Ige as of 2021, where the platforms will be collecting the VAT. But in the meantime, all platforms, non-EU platforms, should be aware that already now, since last year, in the UK and in Germany, platforms, and obviously not only UK platforms or EU platforms, but all platforms, including Chinese platforms, have obligations to ensure the correct payment of UK VAT. And how did that work? So they do not have to collect the VAT directly, but they do have due diligence obligations. So if they facilitate, if a platform anywhere in the world facilitates a supply to a British customer where British VAT is due, they have to make sure that the supplier is registered with the UK Treasury. This is their obligation to verify that they have communicated a valid VAT number. They have to block vendors who would not have a valid VAT number. They also have to block the vendor if HMRC notifies them that they have doubt or whatever, they don't have to motivate. If they ask the platform, block that vendor, they have to do it. And if they do not, then they will be held jointly liable for the unpaid VAT. So due diligence on the one hand, also other data that will have to be collected about the location of the goods at the moment the supply is made and etc. So pretty heavy due diligence obligations, and then possibly joint liability if they fail to block an incompliant vendor. Similar approach in Germany, applicable since 1st January 2019. Also due diligence obligation, which go one step further, because they're the vendors. So if you are a vendor and you are active on any platform and you target the German market, you have to obtain a VAT certificate from the German tax administration. And the marketplace, the platform, will have to collect that VAT certificate. If they do not, well, they will be held liable for the VAT that will, if the VAT is not being paid to the German Treasury. So there again, due diligence obligation, having to collect VAT certificates, also having to collect a lot of information about all the transactions where the goods sold over the platform either leave or arrive in Germany. So it can also be transaction in which German VAT will not be due. Nevertheless, they have record-keeping obligation. And then you also have the second part about being jointly liable in case, well, they fail to show to the administration, so there the burden of the proof is on the marketplace, if they fail to show that they had collected a valid VAT certificate, and if they had any reasons to believe that the supplier was actually not compliant with German VAT rules. So that is pretty heavy, of course, as an obligation. So that is the approach that we have now, UK and Germany. Now, in 2021, newly adopted EU legislation will come into effect. Of course, as of that day, the German legislation will be rescinded. In contrast, the UK legislation probably will remain into place. The legislation adopted at the EU level takes a different approach. There, it's more than just having due diligence obligation. Here, platforms will become deemed suppliers for VAT purposes when they facilitate some supplies, not all of them, only when there is a supply of goods, either domestic in the EU or intra-EU, so when there is a movement of goods from one member state to the other member state, and when that is done by a non-EU company. Because from a VAT perspective, when you qualify a transaction, it does not matter where the supplier is. What matters is where the goods are. So if the goods are in the country of the customer at the moment of the supply, it's a domestic supply. If the goods are in Germany sold to France, but the company is based in the US, it will be an intra-community, an intra-union supply, just because we look at where the goods are. So when one of these transactions, and also when one of these transactions is being made by a non-EU supplier, the platform will become liable to collect the VAT and not the supplier anymore. So again, the idea is that we want to increase chances of compliance because we trust that platforms will be more compliant. They will also become deemed supplier in the case of imports, no matter where the supplier is located in that case. So when goods will enter the EU from a non-EU jurisdiction. In the first cases, there will be registration within the EU and possibility to remit it through a centralized registration system, so one point of registration for the whole EU. In the case of supplies of goods from a third country, so imported goods, there is also a possibility to register. So if you are a Chinese platform and you facilitate an import to an EU customer, you will be the deemed supplier and you have the option to register in the EU, and so you have to collect the VAT and you have to remit it on a periodical basis through that registration scheme. Now, the EU is aware that it will be difficult to require from all these offshore actors to register. So if you do not, well, in that case, there will be, the import will be taxable nevertheless, of course, but then it will be the postal operator who will have to collect the VAT. So for the customer, what is the advantage of registration is that if you are registered, you will charge a VAT included price because you will be in charge of remitting the VAT. If you're not registered, then you will charge a VAT exclusive price, but then the customer will have to pay the VAT separately to the transporter. So from a customer-friendly experience, we believe, of course, that the registration would be more favorable. Also, very important data collection obligation. Now, if you look at this approach, and again, as mentioned also, Australia is taking a similar approach, well, that implies a lot of changes in the internal processes of platforms. The impact is pretty important. The first question is, of course, the first question for a platform, am I concerned by the change? Does it concern all types of platforms? There, the scope of application is defined rather broadly because basically whenever you set the terms and conditions for the underlying supply, you are being caught. So you have to act as a deemed supplier for VAT purposes. Now, of course, the problem is when you do not process yourself the payment. So if you have a platform, you host a lot of businesses, you have them pay a commission or a fee or whatever, but you do not collect the payment from the customers. Nevertheless, you have to collect the VAT. So in that case, it means that you have to chase all your suppliers to make sure that you collect the correct amount of VAT and you can actually remit it in a periodical basis. Then you have the problem of return goods. You sell online, the customer will return the goods, you have to reimburse the customer, you also have to reimburse the VAT. Now, it probably will be the underlying supplier remitting the sales price, and then the platform will have to organize reimbursement of VAT. So a lot of changes from an internal process perspective, and also risks, of course, if one of the suppliers goes bankrupt. Well, nevertheless, he fails to pay you the VAT. You are the deemed supplier. You have to pay the VAT. Another difficulty with the European system is, as I told you, you don't have to collect the VAT in all supplies, only in some supplies. And the question whether you have to collect or not depends on the location of the goods. But you're not always aware where the goods are. I mean, you may be a platform that really controls the whole process, but you may also be a platform, you have no idea whether the goods are in a warehouse in another country, whether they will be imported or not. These are information that you will have to collect from your suppliers because it will have an impact on your liability to collect the tax. And then another issue for platforms is the possibility of having the registration number abused. Why is that so? Well, because in the case of imports, the supply is taxable. So when the customer buys, pays, this is a taxable event. VAT is being charged. This is the taxable event. And then the import, that means the physical entry of the goods in the EU, will be exempt, obviously. Otherwise, it would be taxed twice. Now, the customs authorities, to give you that exemption, they have to make sure that the taxable supply has been taxed, that VAT has been charged, and that the supplier will declare it. So they have to check that a parcel coming in at the border is actually being shipped by someone who is registered and will eventually pay the VAT. Now, how do you check that? The only controls that you're able to perform as a custom authority is that you have a valid registration number. Now, of course, the registration number of Alibaba will be known in 10 minutes probably from the moment of its issuance. So if you use Alibaba's number, or I take Alibaba, any platform number, you use that in the import declaration, you get an exempt supply in, well, you get an exempt import into the EU, because the assumption is that the VAT will be paid separately through the registration system. Now, there is a safe harbor clause now in the implementing regulation that has been adopted. Normally, you should only be liable as a platform for the VAT that you declare through the registration system. Well, nevertheless, of course, this is a reality that the treasuries will have to deal with a lot of abuse of these registration number, and we may only hope, of course, that they will not suspend a registration number just, to stop the leak, because obviously it would have a major impact on you and on your underlying suppliers. And then also controlling the declarations, because as much as we want to believe that the platforms are trustworthy actors, we know that there is a lot of undervaluations at the moment. This is the big problem with e-commerce, B2C e-commerce at the moment. They come at the border. The declaration is that the parcel, the value is $0, €0, €5, or it's a gift. That was also mentioned. Now, this problem is not fixed, because even if you have a platform with a valid registration making monthly declarations, you still have to check that these declarations are correct, that correct amounts of VAT are actually declared. And then the problem is that, again, you have actors outside of your jurisdictional reach. You cannot audit. As an EU tax administration, you will not audit a Chinese platform. Or you may ask the government, so administrative cooperation will be key, of course, for the success of this model. A posteriori audits probably impossible once the goods are in the EU, no way. So probably the focus will be on administrative cooperation, just to make sure that Chinese tax administration will be there with the EU tax administration to make sure that you limit the risk of undervaluation. And then we also have to develop a priori audits, risk assessment procedures, when the goods are on their way to the EU. So we definitely need to invest a lot in technology there to make sure we can actually have screening also on an increasing number of parcels, because what was mentioned is that we do not have any exemption anymore as of 2021. So all parcels, even if it's worth €3, VAT is due on it. So you have a huge volume of customs declaration to verify and of information to verify. Now, general policy question, because this is, once the EU has adopted this model, they were first to implement it, but this is only because of the length of the legislative process. In the EU it takes a lot of time for us to implement it, but Australia has already done it. Many other jurisdictions might have a similar system. For platforms, it means that they will have to collect VAT on underlying sales in 100 perhaps jurisdictions according to different rules. Already now EU and Australian rules are different. Different presumptions apply, different self-harbor clauses apply, so different procedure apply. And so when I was mentioning the phenomenon of concentration, that if you were to name a few platforms, probably you would name 5 marketplaces, but not much more. The problem is that with this kind of administrative burden, there is a great risk that you cannot really expect smaller platforms, new entrants in the market, because of how heavy the compliance burden is. Now, looking at, of course, we are the EU, you are China, we are huge jurisdiction, we have significant leverage on the platform. We can impose obligation because we have this political leverage. But of course, this model probably is not fit for smaller jurisdictions who do not have similar leverage to impose obligations on platforms. And then maybe we can also, this is my last slide, we can also perhaps ask ourselves the question, okay, we count on platforms because nowadays they are major actor in the B2C sector. But maybe this is a cyclical phenomenon, and maybe new entrants in the e-commerce market, they will find strategies outside of platforms. I mean, if I have a web shop, I will need a platform because I'm pretty useless with internet and these things, you know. I need a platform to do my marketing. But I mean, my children, if they ever develop a website, an online business, maybe they will not need the marketplace because they will develop new strategies. And then the strategy of really putting a lot of burden, compliance obligation on platforms will be not so efficient anymore. And when I look at very recently collected figures from Eurostat, so December 2018, showing that there is actually significant turnover that is made by businesses from their own website. They may be on the platform also to attract customer, but then once they have attracted customer with their catalog of products, the customer may actually shift to their own website. So you see now already this trend of having significant volumes of sales taking place on private websites and not so much on the platforms anymore. And therefore, does it make sense to put all this burden on platforms? More generally, for the long term, I believe in any way that we should develop strategies that do not count on these offshore actors anymore. Be it platforms, be it suppliers. This is very counterintuitive in my opinion, that if I am a Belgian resident, I buy on the internet from a Chinese website, my Belgian VAT goes all the way to China, and my tax administration expects the Chinese business to register in Europe and to remit VAT within prescribed taxable deadlines. I think this model is completely counterintuitive. I think with the technology that is now available, we should find a system where my Belgian VAT remains in Belgium. Then when a Chinese customer buys something, Chinese VAT remains in China and does not go all the way to the US expecting that it will come back. That was my final word for now. Thank you.